Fray Damaso stepped up to the pulpit, clearing his throat. He began his sermon with a soft, deliberate tone. Et spiritum bonum dedisti, qui doceret eos, et manatum non prohibisti ab ore iorum, et aquam dedisti eis in citi. He paused, then explained in Spanish, And thou gavest thy good spirit to teach them, and thy manna thou didst not withhold from their mouth, and thou gavest them water for their thirst. Padre Sibila exchanged a glance with the other priests. The sermon was just beginning, and already there was tension in the air. Some priests, like Padre Manuel Martin, seemed uneasy, and others, like Padre Salvi, appeared indifferent. They knew Fray Damaso's style all too well, loud, exaggerated, and sure to stir controversy. This time was no exception. Damaso was infamous for using the pulpit not merely to preach but to settle scores and assert his dominance. Fray Damaso, spotting the alcalde seated prominently in the front, shifted his focus. "Most honorable sir," he said, addressing the town's highest official. "Most holy priests, Christians, brethren in Jesus Christ." He paused dramatically. The silence was thick, and the churchgoers leaned forward, anticipating the coming flood of words. "The first part of the sermon," he continued, "is to be in Spanish. The other—" He stopped to take a deep breath. "In Tagalog. Loquebantur omnes linguas," he added, quoting the scriptures as if to justify the bilingual sermon. Padre Damaso extended his arm slowly towards the altar, holding the gesture in silence, then suddenly pivoted and gestured sharply towards the main doors of the church. The sacristans, taking this as a signal, hurried to close them. The sound of the wooden doors creaking shut echoed throughout the church, locking in the congregation. In the back, the alferez, the head of the civil guard, tensed at the sight of the doors closing. His hand rested on his sword, unsure whether to remain or leave. His mistrust of the friars had only deepened over time, and Fray Damaso's unpredictable sermons often felt like provocations. Fray Damaso's voice grew louder, bolder. "Radiant and resplendent is the altar. Wide is the great door. The air is the vehicle of the holy and divine words that will spring from my mouth." He gestured dramatically, his voice swelling with each phrase. "Hear ye then, with the ears of your souls and hearts, that the words of the Lord may not fall on stony soil, where the birds of hell may consume them." He paused, surveying the faces of the townspeople. They stared up at him, wide-eyed. Many of them couldn't follow his high-flown Spanish, but his booming voice and sweeping gestures were enough to make them feel a deep sense of guilt, even if they couldn't understand why. "O ye great sinners," he thundered, "captives of the moros of the soul, ye are prisoners in the galleys of lust and avarice." His eyes darted toward the alferez, a barely concealed accusation lingering in his gaze. "Ye who toil under the infernal Satan's yoke." The alferez, sitting stiffly at the side, frowned deeply, the mention of Satan and lust not lost on him. He hated these moments when the church, particularly Fray Damaso, tried to publicly shame him in front of the townsfolk. Damaso, without missing a beat, continued, "Look upon him who saves souls from the captivity of the devil, upon the triumphant Roland of Christianity, upon the celestial civil guard." He shot another glance at the alferez. "More powerful than all the earthly guards." Now the priest's voice boomed so loudly that even the simplest townsfolk understood the message. San Diego, a saint revered by many, would save them from evil, but not before Fray Damaso had scolded them thoroughly for their sins. From the back of the church, a group of devout women muttered their approval, nodding at each other. "Salamat sa Dios," one whispered. To them, Fray Damaso's words, though harsh, were righteous. Great affairs are great affairs? Damaso's tone shifted abruptly, sounding more philosophical now, even by the side of the small. And small are always small, even by the side of the great. So history says. The mayor nodded along, unsure of the exact meaning, but feeling it was safe to look approving. History, Damaso continued, warming to his new subject, is made by men. And men, errare es hominum, as Cicero said, make mistakes. He paused dramatically again, letting the phrase linger. The sacristan in the back dozed lightly in his seat. Fray Damaso's eyes flicked toward Ibarra, who sat quietly near the altar. Ibarra, lost in thought, was only half listening. He knew Fray Damaso held a grudge against him for daring to challenge the friar's authority. The priest hadn't forgiven him for past slights. Still, Damaso pressed on, his voice rising again. The sun of virtue shines, not in the night where all is darkness, but in the broad light of day, like our brother Diego. Humble and lowly saint, thy wooden cross. He gestured to the image of San Diego behind him, though the cross the statue held was a shining silver. Thy modest gown honors our great Saint Francis. The words began to blur together for the congregation. The sermon, as always, stretched on, full of grand metaphors and obscure references. Many in the pews were fighting to stay awake. Capitan Tiago, seated near the front, yawned quietly, covering his mouth with a hand. Beside him, Maria Clara fanned herself idly, her thoughts drifting away from the sermon. Ibarra was near, and the idea of seeing him after the Mass filled her heart with a soft warmth. Her gaze wandered to the paintings on the church walls, focusing on a small depiction of purgatory, where souls clung desperately to St. Francis's girdle. Suddenly, Fray Damaso raised his voice again. All should know the scriptures by heart, but many of you have forgotten the Lord's Prayer. He pointed accusingly at the congregation. You live as if you are Protestants, or worse, heretics. Respect not the ministers of God, and you will be cursed. Abba, muttered Carlos, a Chinese shopkeeper who was sitting in the back. Pa le lamaso, he scoffed softly to his companion. You will die in unrepentance. Fray Damaso's voice was thunderous now, shaking the walls. O race of heretics, God will punish you, even on this earth. Women should flee from you. You deserve to be hanged. His words caught in his throat as a slight commotion rose from the back. Two young men, visitors from Manila, stood up abruptly and began making their way out of the church. The devil with the curate, one whispered to the other. Careful, his friend replied. His followers will hear you. Their exit, however, did not go unnoticed. Fray Damaso's face reddened with anger, and his voice faltered as he tried to keep track of his sermon. The congregation stirred, some whispering in confusion, others glancing back to see what had caused the distraction. See? Fray Damaso seized the opportunity, regaining his composure. See how the youth of today disrespect the house of God. This is the consequence of modern thinking, of ignoring the church's wisdom. Ibarra's face remained calm, though his mind churned. He understood the not-so-subtle barbs Fray Damaso aimed at him. The sermon had become personal, full of pointed allusions to his progressive ideas and ambitions for the town. As Fray Damaso worked himself into a frenzy, speaking of the end times, of fire and brimstone, Maria Clara's eyelids drooped. She was exhausted, the droning sermon pulling her into a light slumber. Ibarra, however, remained alert, though his thoughts were far from the church. His mind wandered to the school he hoped to build, a beacon of education and progress for the youth of San Diego. The service dragged on. Many in the congregation, including the alcalde, began to nod off, their heads bobbing as sleep threatened to overtake them. Still, Fray Damaso showed no signs of stopping. He launched into the Tagalog portion of his sermon, his voice becoming even more animated. The older women in the crowd nudged their grandchildren awake, reminding them that this was the part they were supposed to listen to. From the corner of his eye, Ibarra noticed a figure moving quietly through the crowd. It was Elias. The boatman approached him swiftly, leaning in close to whisper, "At the laying of the cornerstone, do not stray from the curate. Do not go near the stone." His voice was urgent, his face pale. "Your life depends on it." Before Ibarra could respond, Elias disappeared back into the crowd, leaving him unsettled and full of questions. What did the boatman mean? Was there danger at the ceremony? Fray Damaso's voice echoed again from the pulpit, but Ibarra's mind was elsewhere now. The cryptic warning from Elias weighed on him, and a sense of foreboding filled his heart. The Mass finally came to a close, and the congregation slowly began to stir from their pews. The mayor stretched and yawned, rubbing his eyes as if to wake himself from a deep sleep. The women crossed themselves and gathered their things, preparing to head home. As Ibarra stood to leave, he glanced toward the pulpit where Fray Damaso stood, wiping sweat from his brow. The priest looked triumphant, as if he had just won a battle. Ibarra's gaze lingered for a moment before he turned to leave, Elias's warning echoing in his ears.